Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks. For this episode, we're honored to have scholar Diana Schaub, who is going to discuss her new book, His Greatest Speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation. Now, the guiding question for this episode is how does Lincoln's speeches represent his principled statesmanship, and how can they help us think about American purpose and identity? By way of introduction, Dr. Diana Schaub is a professor of political science at Loyola University Maryland and is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. She writes extensively on American political thought, especially of Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and African American political thought. She is the co-editor with Amy and Leon Kass of an excellent collection of documents called What So Proudly We Hail the American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song. Diana, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here, Tony.
Great. You know, I really love your new book, His Greatest Speeches. And it is a really remarkable brief book with a really thoughtful and smoothly written book, by the way, on three of Lincoln's speeches. But what I love about the book so much is that, you know, you really point us towards, and maybe Lincoln does as well, your subject, points us towards that sort of larger civic purpose, or it's a great civics lesson, I think. So really a remarkable book. And, you know, my first question. So how did Lincoln's speeches represent his principled statesmanship, and what do they teach us about American purpose and identity, sort of looking at our guiding question here?
Yeah, I like your use of the word statesmanship. I think it is the place to begin with Lincoln. To be a statesman in the highest sense, you have to have a good purpose in view, and then you have to have that special knack of choosing well the means to that purpose. So statesmen are individuals who are both principled and prudent, prudent in the classical sense of possessing practical wisdom. And Lincoln, I believe, had both of those qualities. His principles, of course, were the self-evident truths stated in the Declaration of Independence. As he said when he visited Independence Hall in Philadelphia on his way to assume the presidency, quote, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." So Lincoln then used speech to try to bring Americans back to those founding principles. That project of restoration required more than simply repeating or intoning the founding principles. It required a politically prudential type of speech, speech that was aware of the extent to which Americans had forgotten and in some cases actually repudiated the founding principles. So I think that Lincoln's speeches are masterfully crafted to address specific audiences and to overcome the obstacles to persuasion that their mindset had erected. In other words, Lincoln's speeches were always educative in character. And I think it can actually be hard for us today to understand the political speech of the past. We tend to think of speech as self-expression, but properly political speech is not about self-expression. It aims at persuasion, the persuasion of equals whom one treats as capable of reasoned discourse. So I think maybe one thing that you can learn from studying Lincoln is that the American purpose is somehow both very fragile and robust at the same time. In other words, it's easy to lose our moral compass. It's easy to go awry, as Americans in so many eras have. And yet the principles themselves are timeless. They're capable of ever fresh renewal and rededication.
Excellent, excellent. And looking at one of the first speeches that you discuss in the book, Lincoln promotes the constitutional rule of law, reason over passion, and civic virtue in the young men's Lyceum Address. Why does he do this, and why might it be important for us today to think about these things?
Yeah, well, the three things that you named there, constitutionalism, the primacy of reason, and citizen virtue, those are the essential components or pillars of self-government. Lincoln understood constitutionalism to be the frame within which we live out our dedication to the principles of the Declaration. There's a well-known fragment of writing from Lincoln in which he drew upon the biblical image of the apple of gold set within the frame of silver. He explained what he meant by the metaphor. The golden apple was the Declaration's assertion of liberty to all. And then the picture or the frame around it is the Constitution and Union. In other words, the institutional structure. And in that 1838 Lyceum Address, Lincoln gave a diagnosis of the perils to which popular government is prone. That early speech of his is about particular dangers that America was facing in the late 1830s. He looked around himself and he said, we're having these outbreaks of mob rule. Mob rule was becoming pervasive throughout the land. There was a breakdown in the rule of law as citizens decided that they could just take a shortcut to justice through vigilantism, vigilante action. Lincoln believed that the inevitable result of that growing disregard for the rule of law would be increasing alienation, alienation from our democratic form of government. So, to use language that we use a lot today when we talk about populism, Lincoln doesn't use that word, but it's in a way what he's talking about. And you could say that populism is a threat to popular government. Meaning by popular government, a government based on the will of the people as expressed through the orderly mechanisms of a constitution. So Lincoln saw that mob rule causes citizens to begin to doubt the very possibility of self-government and in consequence to become open to the overthrow of our regime. In other words, citizens would give up on self-government. They would turn to a strongman or a tyrant or a demagogue who could promise security. So in the Lyceum Address, the solution that Lincoln forwards is absolute law abidingness, a kind of law abidingness that would flow from reverence for the Constitution and laws. In other words, Lincoln realizes that our ability to perpetuate our form of government depends on the character of the people. The solidity of our institutions, no matter how well constructed they are, depends on a non-institutional source. Self-government in the collective depends on self-governing individuals. And so that's why Lincoln stresses the need not only for reverence for the law, but for the rule of reason over passion in the human soul. The Lyceum Address is about Lincoln's own time and the dangers that he saw in his day. But it is also an analysis of the lasting problem, the perduring problem of the human passions and the way in which destructive passions like hatred and revenge and inordinate ambition, the way in which those passions can threaten the experiment in self-government. So it's definitely a timeless message one gets from the Lyceum Address.
Great. And maybe now an address, the second speech and address people are maybe a little more familiar with, the Gettysburg Address. Yeah. How do the principles of the Declaration play such a pivotal role? How do they animate the Gettysburg Address? And why are those principles still important?
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting that the Declaration of Independence does not loom very large in Lincoln's early speeches. That's the Lyceum speech from the late 1830s or the speeches that he gave in the 1840s. At that point, I think he believed that the nation could get back on track by a return to constitutionalism. And so that is what he's pressing for in the Lyceum Address. Now, I don't think that Lincoln ever abandoned his fidelity to the Constitution. I think he remains a committed, dedicated constitutionalist. But by the 1850s, it's clear that not only was the frame of the regime under threat, but so too was the apple of gold in the center. And so you see in the 1850s, he has these confrontations with Stephen Douglas, with Roger Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, with the Southern followers of John C. Calhoun, all of those figures and the movements that they represented, all of them were in various ways reinterpreting, traducing, denying the founding principles. And so in the 1850s, Lincoln finds it imperative to return to the Declaration. And in speech after speech, he expounds the self-evident truths set forth in the Declaration. He makes clear what those truths mean for the issue of slavery. Now, we do have to note Lincoln's speeches of the 1850s were not sufficient to bring all Americans to the point of once again holding to those truths. However, they were sufficient to get him elected to the presidency in 1860 and thereby to trigger the attempted secession of those who no longer held to those truths. So that brings us to the Civil War and the Gettysburg Address, which I read as Lincoln's culminating reflection on the Declaration. I think we always need to remember that the Gettysburg Address was a war speech. It was a speech designed to rally the loyal portion of the nation to resist the attempt to destroy and break up the Republic. Lincoln presents his audience with an account of why they are fighting and what they are fighting for. He does that by taking Americans back to 1776, or as he puts it, famously puts it, 77 years ago. In that remarkable 30-word opening sentence of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln reminds his listeners of what the nation is. He defines the nation. Ours is a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And it is that nation and any nation so conceived and so dedicated that is being tested by the Civil War. Once again, as in the Lyceum Address, Lincoln's answer to the problematic maintenance of our form of government rests with the people. They must be not only devoted to the cause of saving the Union, but they must translate that devotion into resolve. Resolve is one of the key words in that final sentence of the Gettysburg Address. In other words, citizens must act in such a way as to achieve the new birth of freedom. It's incumbent on each generation to rededicate themselves to the original principles and then to live them out.
Great. Now, when we visit the Lincoln Memorial, when I did so with my students, and as we take BRI teachers there during summer seminars, I'm always struck by the fact that we have the Gettysburg Address on one side, and then the little lesser known but really important Second Inaugural Address there inscribed in marble, and that's the subject of your third speech. And so how does Lincoln's Second Inaugural Address represent his moral vision for the national union and really the fate of the country? And how is that moral vision maybe in some way still debated today?
Yeah. Before I get to that, let me just follow up on what you said about the Lincoln Memorial. It is. It's one of the benefits of Lincoln's brevity is that he gets the full text.
Right.
There's two speeches, right, on those flanking walls. Everybody else gets little sound bites if they get anything in their memorials. So the Second Inaugural. Both of the two other speeches that we've discussed, Lyceum Address and the Gettysburg Address, both of them are about the United States, but they are also about popular government altogether. The Second Inaugural, I think, is a little different in that it is more purely American. It is grounded more in the specifics of American slavery. And as I read it, the second inaugural is really the original and better 1619 project. It is in the second inaugural with Lincoln that we begin the nation's official reckoning with the 250 years of the slaves' unrequited toil on this land. The date that Lincoln directs us to in the second inaugural is the origin date of slavery in North America. Now, to the extent that there is a solution to this legacy of American slavery, Lincoln finds it in his concluding call to act with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Now, I think one could say a lot about what that might mean, but at a minimum, it means addressing the twin issues of sectional reconciliation and racial reconciliation. Lincoln, I think, was very, very aware of the problems ahead, the problems of Reconstruction. So the sectional problem, you have the problem of Northern arrogance. Many in the North were very ready to punish the South and hold them responsible for having been the beginners of that terrible war. And then, of course, in the South, you have the likelihood of continued recalcitrance. The fact that the defeat of Southern armies didn't really change the oligarchic nature of Southern, what really had become a different regime in the South. And then you have a very pervasive racial problem. There is going to be white resistance to equal political rights for Blacks, not only in the South, but also in the North. And then I think on the Black side, there is the possible danger of anger and rage, an outraged sense of justice at that 250 years of unrequited toil, and the danger of a kind of hopelessness if it seems that the nation can't make progress on racial justice. So Lincoln's interpretation of the war, and that is what he offers in the second inaugural, he offers an interpretation of the war as God's punishment for the sin of American slavery. And I think that sort of political theological interpretation is designed to lessen the likelihood of the sections blaming one another for the war, and also to induce humility and a willingness to begin, at least, the process of racial atonement and reparation. Now, I've used the word reparations, that is much used today. Today, I think that word often takes on a distinctly economic valence. But Lincoln, I think, gives the idea a spiritual or attitudinal valence. Once again, his focus is on preparing public opinion for the difficult work ahead. He does what he can in a speech to try to foster a new spirit of joint striving. I mean, he knows it will take much more than those words, but I think he does hope through those words, and if he can persuade Americans to accept his interpretation of the war, that it will be easier for them to go forward in that spirit of joint striving.
Right. Now, my last question. I've said that your excellent book, His Greatest Speeches, is an excellent civic lesson. And in the appendix, you include the speeches themselves. And so we hope that our citizens, our teachers read the book, of course, your reflections, your thoughtful analysis, but then also the speeches as well. And so what is the important civic purpose today that we continue to read Lincoln's speeches?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that that appendix. I mean, I really do want people to read Lincoln more than to read me. Uh, uh, so yeah, reading Lincoln is kind of like a detox program, by which you rid yourself of acquired toxins. Now, our toxins are different than those of Lincoln's time, but we too have been tempted to jettison the founding principles, to lose sight of the fact that we must preserve both liberty and equality. And somehow we have to figure out how those two things fit together, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Today, I think there are many Americans influenced perhaps by things like the 1619 Project, who see only racism in the American ideal and in American history. They're tempted to see the many disgraceful elements of our history, and I certainly wouldn't deny those, but they're tempted to see those disgraceful elements as part and parcel of the founding, rather than as aberrations from it. There are attempts now, I think, to alter our essential commitments. I hear a lot of talk of equity rather than equality as our aim. Before signing on to that substitution, I think it would be very important to think deeply about what equity might mean for liberty, what it might mean for equality, understood as the possession of equal rights. So I think Lincoln is still our best resource for understanding our founding principles and the best model for how to go about defending them. So yeah, everybody needs to to read more Lincoln and to think more about what we learned from Lincoln.
Good advice. Well, your book is certainly a great help in that. His Greatest Speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation. Diana Schaub, I want to thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts about your remarkable new book.
Thank you. Really
Great,
enjoyed it.
Great. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our library of other interviews with some great scholars on Abraham Lincoln, including Ellen Gelzo, Lucas Morrell, John Schaff, James Oakes, and others. So check them out on YouTube. Thanks.